If you're watching this at 3:47 a.m., heart racing, mind spinning, wondering if this crushing weight on your chest means you're following your husband to the grave, breathe. You're not dying. You're awakening. What you're about to witness is Margaret's journey from grinding against life to discovering soul flowing, from 3 a.m. panic to 5 a.m. peace. For the next 60 minutes, you'll see exactly how a 57-year-old widow transformed her darkest hours into her most powerful spiritual practice. Because here's what nobody tells Christian women over 50. That 3:47 wake-up isn't a curse. It's an invitation to something your soul has been craving since before David died, before the kids moved away, before you forgot who you were meant to become. The sheets were soaked again, twisted around Margaret's legs like restraints. For the 43rd night in a row, the red digits on David's side of the bed glowed 3:47 a.m., and her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The house creaked with sounds that used to comfort. Now every settling board whispered, "Widow, widow, widow." She pressed her palm against her chest, counting beats the way David taught her when anxiety struck. But David wasn't here to count with her anymore. This wasn't normal grief. She knew that much. Grief was supposed to fade after 2 years, not transform into this nightly resurrection of terror. "Please, God," Margaret whispered into the darkness. But the words felt hollow, like prayers bouncing off a ceiling that had become concrete instead of gateway. The voice of wasted years slithered through her mind. "Even God has given up on you. You're 57, alone, and running out of time." She grabbed David's pillow, still on his side after 24 months, and pressed it against her face, searching for his scent that had long since faded. But tonight, something else emerged. Memory of him writing in his journal at this exact hour. Years ago, something about flowing instead of fighting. The thought vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the familiar taste of fear. This wasn't how Christian women over 50 were supposed to feel. Where was the peace that passes understanding? Margaret had taught Sunday school for 30 years, led women's Bible studies, prayed over hundreds of struggling souls. Yet here in her own dark night, those memorized verses crumbled like ancient paper. She could recite Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." But stillness felt like drowning, and knowing felt impossible when her mind raced through every worst-case scenario. The shame burned hotter than the night sweats. Strong Christian women didn't collapse at 3:47 a.m. They didn't doubt God's presence. They certainly didn't fantasize about the sleeping pills in the medicine cabinet. Tomorrow, she promised herself, tomorrow she'd call Pastor Jim, admit she was struggling, maybe even mention the chest pains. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't. The last time she'd tried, his wife had patted her hand and said, "Just give it to God, dear. He's never late." Margaret had smiled, nodded, gone home, and screamed into David's pillow until her throat went raw. Giving it to God felt like throwing stones into an empty well. No splash, no echo, just endless falling. She'd been a woman of faith for 57 years, but faith at 3:47 a.m. was as substantial as morning mist. The clock clicked to 3:48, and Margaret made the same bargain she'd made for 42 nights before. "Just let me sleep until 5 a.m. 2 hours, God. That's all I need." But sleep wouldn't come, only the familiar spiral, checking her pulse, Googling heart attack symptoms, women, reading the same medical websites until her eyes burned. By 4:30, she'd be in the kitchen, making coffee she wouldn't drink, staring at David's Bible on the counter, afraid to open it because what if the words were still just words? But that's when she noticed something she'd never seen before, tucked into the pages, a sticky note in David's handwriting. "Soul flowing begins when forcing ends." The chest pains started at exactly 3:47, sharp as a knife between her ribs, radiating down her left arm in waves that matched her racing pulse. Margaret knew these weren't David's symptoms. His heart had simply stopped. No warning, no goodbye, just gone between one breath and the next. But her body was writing its own story of ending, each night more convincing than the last. She pressed her fingers to her neck, counting beats too fast, definitely too fast, probably atrial fibrillation, maybe a blood clot. The medical words she'd learned in those first terrible months after David became weapons her mind used against her. Tonight, the pain felt different, more real, more final. David's last morning haunted these 3:47 wake-ups like a ghost that wouldn't rest. He'd kissed her goodbye at 5 a.m., heading to his men's prayer group, mentioned something about finally understanding the flow he'd been seeking. 3 hours later, he was gone. The doctors said it was instant, painless, but how did they know? What if he'd felt this same crushing weight, this same certainty of ending, alone in his car while other men prayed, unaware? The thought made Margaret's hands shake as she reached for the blood pressure cuff she now kept on the nightstand. 168/95. Dangerous. The numbers glowed as accusingly as the clock. You're manifesting your own death, Sarah had said last week, her lawyer voice sharp with frustration. Mom, this obsession with dying is literally killing you. But Sarah didn't understand what it was like to wake in the marriage bed alone. To feel your body betraying you at the exact moment your faith should be strongest. Sarah, 32 and thriving, thought grief had an expiration date. That 2 years was enough time to move forward. She'd even sent links to therapists, grief counselors, a meditation app for Christian women over 50. As if Margaret could meditate her way out of this cellular certainty that her time was running out, that she was failing the test God had set before her. The voice of wasted years grew louder in these pre-dawn hours, reciting its familiar litany, 57, and falling apart. Your best years are behind you. David was your purpose, and now you're just marking time until you join him. Margaret tried to counter with scripture, but the words felt like trying to hold water in broken hands. Even prayer had become performance, going through the motions while her spirit remained locked in this prison of flesh and fear. She'd tried everything: praise music, prayer journals, even sleeping on the couch to escape the memorial that their bedroom had become. Nothing worked. The 3:47 wake-up was as reliable as sunrise, except sunrise brought no relief. But tonight, as her fingers found David's journal again, the one she'd discovered last month but couldn't bear to read, something made her open it. His handwriting, so familiar it made her chest ache in a different way, filled the pages with dates all marked 3:47 a.m. Her breath caught. David had been waking at this hour too, long before his death, but his words weren't about fear. They were about something he called soul flowing, a rhythm he was learning, a dance with the divine that began precisely when human strength ended. The last entry, dated the morning he died, read, "Finally understand. Stop grinding, start flowing. Tell M when the time is right. She'll know when she's ready." The bathroom mirror at 3:47 a.m. had become Margaret's confessor, the only witness to her complete unraveling. Tonight, she didn't recognize the woman's staring back hollow eyes. Gray skin, David's old robe hanging off shoulders that had carried so much and now felt too weak to carry anything at all. "Am I dying?" she asked her reflection, and for the first time, she wanted the answer to be yes. Not suicide. Good Christian women didn't think such things, but a passive surrender, a giving up that looked like giving in. The face in the mirror didn't argue, just stared back with the same exhausted acceptance. This wasn't the vibrant Sunday school teacher who'd inspired hundreds of women to trust God through their darkest valleys. That Margaret had answers, quoted scripture with authority, laid hands on the sick with absolute faith they'd be healed. This 3:47 a.m. Margaret was a fraud, a hypocrite who preached peace while drowning in panic, who promised others that God never abandoned his children while feeling completely forsaken. The shame was almost worse than the fear. She'd built her entire identity on being a strong Christian woman, and now that identity was crumbling like sand through desperate fingers. Even her prayers had become accusations. "Where are you? Why won't you help me? What did I do wrong?" The voice of wasted years had a field day with her bathroom mirror confessions. "Look at yourself. Is this what 57 years of faith produces?" A terrified woman in her dead husband's robe, bargaining with God for 2 hours of sleep. Margaret gripped the sink, knuckles white, fighting the urge to punch the mirror, to shatter this reflection that showed too much truth. But violence wasn't in her nature. She was Minnesota nice. Church lady sweet, the one who brought casseroles and never complained. She was also dying inside, one 3:47 wake up at a time. And nobody knew, because she'd perfected the art of Sunday morning smiles. God, if you're listening, she whispered, not even sure anymore if prayer was reaching heaven or just echoing in her empty chest. I need something real. Not another verse, not another platitude, not another person telling me to trust your timing. I need you to show up in this bathroom at 3:47 a.m. and tell me why you're letting this happen. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own blood rushing through her ears. But then, impossibly, she heard something else, not a voice, but a presence, a stirring in the stillness that made her look back at the mirror. For just a moment, she saw something different in her reflection. Not death, but birth. Not ending, but beginning. The realization hit her like cold water. She'd been trying to force her way back to who she was before David died, grinding against reality, fighting the current of change. But what if this thought came unbidden? Maybe from God, maybe from David, maybe from her own desperate soul. What if this 347 darkness was actually a doorway? What if finding purpose after 50 meant letting the old Margaret die completely so something new could be born? The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She looked at the clock, 3:52 a.m. For the first time in 43 nights, she didn't check her pulse. Google knew Margaret's secret. Her 3 a.m. search history read like a medical student's nightmare. Chest pain, women over 50, anxiety or heart attack, how to tell. Sudden death warning signs, biblical rest for women with anxiety. Is 57 too old to start over? The algorithm had started serving her ads for funeral planning and life insurance, as if the internet itself had decided her fate. But tonight, a different search result caught her Aja forum post titled, The 3:47 a.m. Club. Christian women over 50 who can't sleep. Her finger hovered over the link. She wasn't alone. There were others grinding through these pre-dawn hours, trying to force themselves back to sleep, back to faith, back to who they used to be. MIT research shows that 73% of women over 50 experience severe nighttime anxiety. But Christian women report it 30% less, not because they experience it less, but because they're ashamed to admit it. Margaret read this statistic 3 times, feeling seen and exposed simultaneously. The forum was filled with stories that could have been hers, since Robert passed. 3:47 every night, wrote Diane from Texas. Doctor says stress, pastor says lack of faith. I say I'm losing my mind, added Susan Grace, 1951. These weren't weak women or failed Christians, they were wives, mothers, grandmothers, Sunday school teachers, all waking at the same cursed hour, all wondering if God had forgotten their names. The pattern was so consistent it felt supernatural. Her phone buzzed. Sarah, texting at 3:48 a.m. from Seattle. Mom, are you awake? I know you are. We need to talk about getting you help. Margaret's chest tightened, not with panic this time, but with shame. Her daughter was losing sleep over her mother's inability to sleep. The legacy she was leaving wasn't faith or strength, but worry and 3 a.m. interventions. She started to type, I'm fine, honey, go back to sleep, then deleted it. She wasn't fine. Hadn't been fine since David's heart stopped beating at approximately the same time she now woke each night. Instead, she typed, yes, awake, but something's changing. I found Dad's journals. He knew something about this hour. The forum mentioned something else, a phenomenon called the holy hour wake-up, where women described being pulled from sleep not by anxiety but by invitation. Some called it spiritual productivity, others divine appointment. But one woman used a phrase that made Margaret's breath catch, soul flowing. Forever, his 6:2 wrote, ladies, what if we're not broken? What if we're being broken open? What if 3:47 isn't about fear but about finding purpose after 50, when the world says we're done but God says we're just beginning? The comment had 347 likes and dozens of responses from women who'd transformed their 3:47 wake-ups into what they called their power hour with God. Sarah's response came quickly. Mom, Dad's journals aren't going to fix this. You need real help, professional help. I've found a therapist who specializes in grief and anxiety in older women. Margaret stared at the text, then back at the forum. then at David's journal on the nightstand. Two paths diverged at 3:47 a.m. One led to medication and management, the other to mystery and maybe madness. But what if there was a third path? The one David had been walking those mornings before he died. The one these women were discovering in their darkest hours. She typed back, "Give me 30 days. I'm trying something Dad called soul flowing. If it doesn't work, I'll see your therapist." Sarah's typing dots appeared and disappeared 5 times before her. Response: "I'm scared for you." Margaret replied with the first honest thing she'd said in months. "Me too. But maybe scared is where faith actually begins." "Your pastor won't tell you this," Margaret whispered to her reflection at 3:47 a.m., practicing a speech she'd never give. But God speaks louder in your kitchen at 3 a.m. than in most Sunday services. That's what David called soul-flowing meeting. God where religion fears to tread. The words felt blasphemous and liberating simultaneously. For 57 years, she'd been the model Christian woman. Over 50 never missed Sunday service. Taught Wednesday Bible study, organized prayer chains for everyone else's crises. But when her own crisis came, when David's heart stopped and hers kept breaking, the church had no room for her complicated grief. They wanted her testimony of triumph, not her testament of terror. The voice of wasted years loved this particular shame. You pray for others' healing but wake in panic. You quote verses about peace but pop anticides like candy. What kind of spiritual leader can't even lead herself out of darkness? Margaret knew the voice was right. She was a fraud, preaching faith-based productivity while privately falling apart, talking about biblical rest while unable to sleep past 3:47. The worst part, she couldn't tell anyone. Strong Christian women were supposed to be prayer warriors, not anxiety patients. They were supposed to model overcoming burnout Christian style, not embody it. The mask she wore on Sundays was getting heavier, and her face underneath was disappearing. Last Sunday, Pastor Jim had preached about spiritual rest, about mature women of faith being pillars of peaceful strength. Margaret had sat in her usual pew third row, left side where she'd sat with David for 20 years, and felt like screaming. Peaceful strength. She was holding herself together with coffee and concealer, her Bible full of sticky notes that said things like "Try to believe this," and David did, "Why can't I?" When Pastor Jim asked for prayer requests, she'd almost raised her hand. Almost admitted that the women's ministry leader was drowning. But then Mrs. Henderson shared about her cat's surgery, and the moment passed. Nobody wanted to hear that Margaret was questioning everything. That finding purpose after 50 felt like finding water in a desert. Rumors and mirages, but no real relief. "The church lie that kills women's faith," she said aloud, testing the words David had written in his journal, "is that struggle means sin, that doubt means failure, that 3:47 a.m. wake-ups mean God has withdrawn his presence." David's journal was becoming her new Bible, more honest than any sermon she'd heard since he died. He wrote about his own midnight wrestlings, his discovery that soul-flowing isn't about being strong but about being surrendered. Not about forcing faith but about flowing with honesty, and when honesty means admitting you're terrified. These weren't the words of a weak man but of someone who'd found strength in admitting weakness. Margaret wondered how many other Christian women over 50 were hiding their 3:47 reality behind Sunday smiles. Ruth, the church janitor, found Margaret crying in the bathroom after service last week. Instead of offering the usual platitudes, Ruth had said something strange. "Child, God doesn't always show up in the light. Sometimes he's waiting in the kitchen at 3:47, where nobody can see you fall apart except him. That's where real faith, what I call soul-flowing faith, begins. Not in performance but in the mess." Ruth had pressed a small card into Margaret's hand with just a Bible verse, and a time psalm, Populuinum bonding sapulo. 5 a.m. Margaret had thought Ruth was senile, but now, reading David's similar words, she wondered if the janitor knew something the pastor didn't, that God preferred honest darkness to performed light. The kitchen floor was cold against Margaret's cheek, coffee spreading in a dark pool that looked too much like blood in the pre-dawn light. She'd stood up too fast at 4:15 a.m., dizzy from another sleepless night, and her legs had simply given out. Not a heart attack, Just exhaustion so complete that her body staged its own intervention. For a moment, she didn't try to get up. Just lay there watching the coffee creep toward David's chair. The one she still couldn't bring herself to move. This was it. Rock bottom had an actual floor, and it was covered in medium roast and shame. 57 years old, and she was literally fallen, unable to rise. The perfect metaphor for everything she'd become. The voice of wasted years had a field day. David would be so disappointed. Look at you, supposed woman of faith, sprawled on linoleum like a common drunk. Is this your spiritual productivity? Your biblical rest? But for once, the voice seemed distant, muffled by the strange peace of complete surrender. Margaret had tried everything, forcing herself to pray, grinding through devotionals, pushing toward healing like it was a destination she could reach through sheer will. But here, on the floor, coffee soaking through David's robe, she finally understood what he'd written. Soul flowing begins when forcing ends. She'd been trying to force her way back to normal, force herself to sleep, force God to show up on her timeline. The forcing had literally knocked her down. Her phone buzzed on the counter above Sarah. Always Sarah. Somehow knowing. But Margaret didn't reach for it. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She laughed. Not the polite church laugh, or the I'm fine laugh, but a deep, probably hysterical laugh at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, a Christian woman over 50, supposed pillar of faith, lying in spilled coffee at 4:15 a.m., and it was the most honest she'd been with God since David died. Okay, she said to the ceiling, to God, to David, to whoever was listening, I surrender. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend, can't perform, can't force my way through. If you want me to learn this soul-flowing thing, you're going to have to teach me, because I'm done trying to figure it out myself. The surrender felt like death and birth, simultaneously. Death to the Margaret who had everything together, who never admitted weakness, who taught others about faith-based productivity while secretly falling apart. Birth to someone new, someone who could lie on a coffee-stained floor and find it holy ground. She thought about Moses and his burning bush. Paul knocked off his horse. Mary told she'd carry the impossible. They all had their floors, their moments of complete upheaval where the old way ended and something unimaginable began. Maybe this was hers. Maybe 57 wasn't too late for resurrection. Maybe David had known she'd need to fall completely before she could learn to flow. Slowly, Margaret pulled herself up, not because she was strong but because she heard something, a whisper. Maybe imagination, maybe divine. 5 a.m. Meet me at 5 a.m. She looked at the clock, 4:47. 13 minutes until this proposed appointment with whatever God was doing in her darkness. She didn't clean up the coffee, didn't change out of the soaked robe, didn't even wipe her face. She just sat at David's place at the table, opened his Bible, not hers. Hers was too full of trying, and waited. For the first time in 43 nights of 3:47 wake-ups, she wasn't trying to get back to sleep or force herself to feel better. She was just present, broken, coffee-stained, and somehow, mysteriously, ready. The morning routine with God she'd been forcing was about to become something else entirely, a flowing she couldn't have imagined from the floor. The medical chart looked like a crime scene, David's name crossed out in black ink. Margaret's added below in clinical blue, as if she was just the sequel to his story. Dr. Harrison, barely 30, and still optimistic about medicine's ability to fix everything, tapped his pen against the test results. Mrs. Robertson, your heart is fine. EKG normal. Blood work normal. Everything normal. It's stress. Classic anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms in women your age. Women your age, as if 57 was a diagnosis. As if being a Christian woman over 50 automatically meant accepting that your body would betray you with phantom pains. Margaret wanted to scream that nothing about waking at 3:47 a.m. with crushing chest pain felt normal, but she just nodded. Good Christian women didn't argue with doctors. I can prescribe something for the anxiety, Dr. Harrison continued, already reaching for his prescription pad, the universal medical answer to everything they couldn't explain. Xanax for acute episodes, maybe an SSRI for long-term management. Very common for women dealing with grief and menopause simultaneously. Menopause and faith, two words that nobody in her church would ever connect, as if holy women didn't have hormones, as if spiritual rest could overcome hot flashes and night terrors. Margaret stared at the prescription, thinking about David's journal entry. They wanted to medicate my 3:47 wake-ups too. But medication would have made me miss the invitation to soul flowing. Dr. Margaret heard herself say, surprising them both. What if it's not stress? What if my body is trying to tell me something besides take a pill? What if this 3:47 wake-up is actually important? Dr. Harrison's smile was patronizing, the one reserved for difficult patients who thought they knew better than medical science. Mrs. Robertson, chronic sleep disruption is serious. You have 90 days to show improvement, or we need to discuss more aggressive interventions. Your symptoms mirror your husband's precardiac event patterns. I don't want you to follow his path. 90 days. 3 months to prove she could find another way, David's way. This soul flowing that sounded more like poetry than medicine. Ruth was waiting in the parking lot, sitting on the hood of her ancient Buick, like she'd been expecting Margaret to emerge at exactly this moment. Let me guess, the church janitor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd cleaned up too many messes to be fooled by tidy diagnoses, stress and medication, right? That's what they told me 30 years ago when I started waking at 3:47, before I'd learned about spiritual productivity, before I understood that God doesn't always heal, sometimes He transforms. You ready to learn about soul flowing, or you want to try their pills first? Ruth's eyes held no judgment, just invitation. Margaret looked at the prescription in her hand, then at this unlikely mentor in orthopedic shoes and a cardigan older than Sarah. David wrote about you, Margaret said, the realization sudden and certain. In his journal, he mentioned a Ruth who understood the flow. That's you. Ruth's laugh was rich and deep, nothing like the quiet janitor who emptied trash cans during sermons. Your David was one of the few who listened. Most Christian women over 50 are too busy performing strength to admit they need a different way. But you lying on that kitchen floor this morning, coffee everywhere, finally surrendering you're ready. Meet me tomorrow at 5 a.m., not at church, at my kitchen. Bring David's Bible and an empty journal. Leave your pride in that coffee stain. Ruth drove off before Margaret could respond, leaving her standing in the medical center parking lot, prescription in one hand, possibility in the other. The voice of wasted years whispered about foolishness, about trusting janitors over doctors. But Margaret was done listening to that voice. She had 90 days and nothing left to lose. Margaret sat in her car outside First Baptist at 4:58 a.m., watching the sanctuary lights flicker on for early morning prayer. She'd driven here on autopilot, muscle memory from decades of Wednesday morning intercession, but she couldn't make herself go inside. Through the windows, she could see the faithful Futha ones who never struggled, never doubted, never woke at 3:47, wondering if God had changed his phone number. Her hand hovered over the door handle for the 100th time. Inside was performance, pretense, the exhausting act of being a spiritual leader when she felt spiritually bankrupt. Outside was honesty, isolation, and a text from Ruth. You sitting in that church parking lot. Drive to my house instead. Real soul flowing doesn't happen in sanctuaries. The internal saboteur she'd stopped calling it, the voice of wasted years, David's journal had named it better, seized this moment. You can't even enter God's house. What kind of Christian woman over 50 hides from church? You're not having a spiritual awakening. You're having a spiritual breakdown. Margaret typed a text to the prayer group. Can't make it this morning. Not feeling well. Not feeling well, the Christian code for everything from cancer to crisis of faith. Susan would gossip, Patricia would judge, but Margaret didn't care anymore. She was tired of pretending that finding purpose after 50 meant maintaining the facade. Her soul was screaming silent cries that nobody could hear because she'd perfected the art of suffering quietly, decorously, like a good Christian woman should. Ruth's house sat on the wrong side of town, where the church sent Christmas baskets, but never visited. The janitor answered the door in a housecoat covered in roses. her gray hair in pink curlers, looking nothing like a spiritual mentor, and everything like someone who'd stopped caring what people thought. "You actually came," Ruth said, not surprised but pleased. Most don't. They'd rather suffer properly than heal messily. "Come in, coffee's ready, and before you ask, yes, I wake at 3:47 too. Have for 30 years. Difference is, I learned to stop fighting it." The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and honesty. No trace of the performative perfection Margaret maintained in her own home. "First thing about soul flowing," Ruth said, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs, "is you stop hiding. That silent cry you've been swallowing every morning, let it out. God's not afraid of your mess, Margaret. He's been waiting for you to stop cleaning it up long enough for him to transform it." Ruth opened her own journal, pages covered in raw, honest prayers that looked nothing like the formatted devotionals Margaret had been forcing herself through. "See this? May 15th, 3 years ago. God, I hate you today. Hate that you took Harold. Hate that you left me here. Hate that I still have to pretend to love you at church." That's real faith-based productivity producing honesty instead of performance. Margaret's tears came suddenly, violently. The kind that shake your whole body and don't care about mascara or dignity. "I text everyone I'm fine while I'm dying inside," she sobbed, the words ripping out like shrapnel. "I wake at 3:47 terrified, but I can't tell anyone because I'm supposed to be the strong one. The one with answers, the one who models biblical rest for women. But I haven't rested since David died. I haven't really breathed. I've just been performing, grinding, forcing myself through each day, and I'm so tired." Ruth, so tired of pretending this is working when it's not. Ruth didn't comfort or condemn, just nodded like she'd heard this confession 100 times. "Good," she said simply. "Now you're ready to learn what David discovered that. Soul flowing begins when you stop hiding your 3:47 truth and start honoring it." The wind at 3:47 a.m. came through the window Margaret never remembered leaving open, rifling through David's Bible on the nightstand like invisible fingers searching for something specific. She watched, transfixed, as the pages settled on Isaiah 43, not her favorite comfort chapter, but David's, the one with more highlights than white space. The breeze carried something else, something that made her skin prickle with recognition rather than fear. It sounded like no, it couldn't be, but it sounded like David's voice, or maybe God's, or maybe they were the same thing now, whispering, "Meet me at 5 a.m., not to perform, just to be." Margaret's rational mind said it was just wind, neurons firing, grief playing tricks, but her soul, that part that had been slowly dying, suddenly stirred like Lazarus, hearing his name. The voice of the internal saboteur tried to intervene. "You're having a psychotic break." Hearing voices is mental illness, not divine invitation. But for once, its argument felt weak, desperate, like it knew its reign of terror was ending. Margaret had read David's journal entry from 3 years ago. The 3:47 wake-up isn't the problem, it's the resistance to it. God whispers at 3:47 but waits until 5 a.m., when we're exhausted enough to stop trying to control the conversation. She looked at the clock, 3:52. Over an hour until this proposed meeting, this potential for soul flowing that David had discovered in his own darkness. What if Christian women over 50 were all receiving this same invitation but missing it, because they were too busy trying to get back to sleep? Ruth had said something yesterday that haunted Margaret. The divine doesn't shout over our chaos. It whispers in the margins, in the spaces we're too afraid to enter. Your 3:47 isn't punishment, it's preparation. By 5 a.m., you're empty enough to be filled. It sounded like New Age nonsense. Except Ruth backed everything with scripture, with testimonies from women who'd transformed their insomnia into intercession, their anxiety into spiritual productivity. Margaret pulled David's journal closer, finding an entry that made her breath catch. March 15th, 3:47 a.m. The whisper again, "Meet me at 5. I'm starting to understand this isn't about morning routine with God. It's about learning the rhythm of heaven, which doesn't follow earthly time. Soul flowing means syncing with eternal tempo, not forcing temporary fixes." The wind settled, but the invitation remained, hanging in the air like incense. Margaret did something she hadn't done in months. She prepared. Not with the frantic energy of trying to earn God's presence, but with the gentle anticipation of meeting a friend. She made coffee, David's brand, not hers. Lit a candle, the one from his funeral she'd been saving, and opened a fresh journal, leather-bound, his last gift. She didn't plan what to pray or study. Ruth had been clear. Soul flowing isn't about agenda. It's about availability. Show up at 5 a.m. and let God lead the dance. The mixing of metaphors should have bothered Margaret's organized mind, but nothing about this journey was fitting into neat theological boxes anymore. At 4:59 a.m., Margaret sat in David's chair at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, journal open to a blank page. She didn't pray, didn't speak, didn't even consciously think. She just waited, like Mary at the tomb, not knowing what resurrection looked like, but certain something was about to change. At exactly 5 a.m., she felt it, not heard, but felt a presence filling the kitchen, warm and familiar, and completely other. The candle flame danced without any breeze. Her journal page remained blank, but her soul began filling with something she couldn't name yet. This wasn't the God of Sunday sermons or Wednesday night studies. This was the God of 5 a.m. kitchens and broken women and whispered invitations. This was what David had found in his seeking. This was soul flowing, and it was about to change everything Margaret thought she knew about finding purpose after 50. Margaret's hands trembled so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim, droplets landing on Psalm 46 like tears. She wasn't crying yet. 5 a.m. felt different than 3:47 thinner. Somehow, like the veil between heaven and earth was gossamer instead of concrete. David's Bible lay open, but the words swam before her eyes, not from tears but from something else, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and being invited to jump. The kitchen, usually her domain of control and comfort, felt charged with presence, like the moments before lightning strikes. She wanted to run, to retreat to bed, and pretend this wasn't happening. But Ruth's words anchored her. First time soul flowing feels like dying because it is dying to control, dying to performance, dying to everything except raw encounter. Sarah's call shattered the sacred tension at 5:07 a.m., her daughter's name lighting up the phone screen like an accusation. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to answer. Sarah never called this early unless, but then she stopped. This was her test, her choosing. Answered the phone and returned to the pattern of responding to everyone's needs, except the divine invitation in front of her. Or let it ring and choose this mysterious soul flowing over her daughter's crisis. The phone rang 4 times, 5, then silence. The internal saboteur pounced. What kind of mother ignores her daughter? What if it's an emergency? What if she needs you? But Margaret was learning to recognize the voice that had kept her grinding instead of flowing, performing instead of being present. I choose you, Margaret whispered to the presence, filling her kitchen, and immediately felt ridiculous. Talking to air, choosing invisible over visible, trusting whispers over phone calls. This wasn't faith-based productivity, as she'd understood it. This was something wilder, less controlled, more dangerous. She picked up David's pen, the one she'd never used because it felt like grave robbing, and wrote in the margin of Psalm 46, Day 1 of soul flowing. Hands shaking, Sarah calling, choosing to stay. The words looked foreign in her handwriting, like someone else was already beginning to emerge from this 5 a.m. encounter. The mature women of faith she knew would judge this as irresponsible. But the woman being born in this moment didn't care about their approval anymore. The Bible passage came alive without her reading it. She simply knew it, felt it, became it. Be still and know that I am God. But this wasn't the tame Sunday school version about quiet meditation. This was stillness like the eye of a hurricane, knowing like gnosis, God like consuming fire. Margaret's hands stopped shaking, not from peace but from something more like awestruck paralysis. This was what David had found in his 5 a.m. meetings. What had made him write soul-flowing changes everything in margins throughout his Bible. This wasn't about morning routine with God, this was about God's routine with morning. With creation, with broken women who finally stopped trying to hold themselves together. Sarah's text arrived at 5:23. Mom, why didn't you answer? I'm worried about you. This obsession with Dad's journals isn't healthy. Please, call me back. Margaret looked at the message, then at the journal where she'd written 3 pages without remembering moving the pen. The pages were filled with words that looked like her handwriting but felt like heaven's dictation. Promises, revelations, truths about spiritual growth after 50 that no sermon had ever touched. She photographed one line and sent it to Sarah. I'm not obsessed with Dad's journals. I'm discovering what he discovered that 5 a.m. is when God prefers to meet broken people, because that's when we're finally quiet enough to hear. Sarah's response was immediate. Mom, you're scaring me. Margaret typed back. Good. I've been scaring myself for months. Maybe scared is where real faith begins. Then she turned off her phone, returned to the journal, and let soul flowing teach her what no church ever had. That finding purpose after 50 meant finding God in the mess, not despite it. Stop praying for happiness, Ruth said, her voice cutting through Margaret's carefully constructed theology like a blade through tissue paper. They sat in Ruth's kitchen at 5 a.m., third day of what Ruth called soul-flowing training, though it felt more like spiritual demolition. God uses your 3 a.m. darkness more than your Sunday smile. Biblical rest isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's the rest that comes from stopping the performance, even if that means sitting in darkness until dawn. You Christian women over 50 have been sold a lie that faith looks like perpetual sunshine, but God does his best work in the dark. Ask Mary, the angel came at night. Ask Nicodemus, Jesus taught him after midnight. Ask Jacob, he wrestled until dawn. The controversy of Ruth's words should have offended Margaret's conventional faith, but instead, they felt like water to a dying plant. She'd been forcing positive thinking, gratitude lists, praise music, all the prescribed remedies for Christian women struggling with anxiety, but none of it had touched the 347 terror because she'd been trying to bypass the darkness instead of meeting God in it. Ruth opened her worn Bible to John 1. The light shines in the darkness. Not despite it, not after it, but in it. Your menopause and faith journey isn't about overcoming the night sweats and anxiety. It's about discovering that God sweats with you, anxiously waits with you, meets you exactly where religion says he shouldn't be. Here's what nobody tells mature women of faith, Ruth continued, pouring tea that smelled like earth and honesty. God isn't interested in your performance of strength. He's interested in your honest weakness. That 347 wake up, that's when your soul is too exhausted to maintain pretense. That's when the real you, not the Sunday you, not the ministry leader you, not even the grieving widow, you, but the raw, terrified, desperate you emerges. And that's exactly who God wants to meet. Soul flowing isn't about forcing yourself into God's presence through spiritual productivity. It's about realizing he's been waiting in your darkness all along. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart, but the shell around it. But the Bible says rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks. She protested weakly, clinging to verses that had become burdens rather than blessings. Ruth's laugh was gentle but uncompromising. Paul wrote that from prison, in chains, in darkness. He wasn't talking about fake happiness, he was talking about finding God in the dungeon. Your 347 wake-up is your dungeon, and instead of trying to escape it, soul-flowing means learning to dance with God in chains until they become instruments instead of imprisonment. The AJOURNAL entry Margaret wrote that morning would later become her manifesto. God meets women in the dark because that's where we stop performing and start being. The church wants triumphant testimonies, but God wants honest encounters. I've been trying to overcome burnout Christian style through more trying, more forcing, more grinding, toward healing. But Ruth is teaching me that biblical rest sometimes means resting in the darkness, not rushing toward light. Soul flowing means letting God find me at 347 instead of trying to find him at 9:30 Sunday service. This is heresy to everything I've taught, and it's the truest thing I've ever learned. She closed the journal and looked at Ruth, who was smiling like a mother watching her child take first steps. Ready for the real work? Ruth asked. Because tomorrow, we talk about why Martha was right and Mary was incomplete, and why you need both for true spiritual rest. The tears hit Psalm 46 minutes and 10 seconds at exactly 5:17 a.m., turning Be Still and Know into a watercolor blur that somehow made more sense than the crisp black letters ever had. Margaret wasn't crying from sadness, but from recognition. This verse she'd quoted 1,000 times was suddenly three-dimensional, alive, personal. David had highlighted it in 7 different colors over the years, each layer representing another level of understanding. But his final note, in shaky handwriting from his last morning, simply said, "Finally, still enough to know." Soul flowing is the stillness after you stop forcing stillness. Margaret traced his words with her finger, feeling the impression his pen had left, like touching his hand across time. For the first time in 45 nights, Margaret wasn't checking her pulse, wasn't afraid of the chest tightness, wasn't bargaining with God for sleep or peace or David back. She was breathing, really breathing, not the shallow gasps of anxiety, but the deep belly breaths Ruth had taught her. "Breathe like you're already dead," Ruth had said yesterday, which sounded morbid until she explained. Dead to performance, dead to fear, dead to everything except this moment where God is. That's spiritual productivity producing presence instead of progress. Margaret breathed in for 4 counts, held for 4, released for 4, and in that rhythm found something she'd lost when David died: her own heartbeat, steady and sufficient, not racing toward death but flowing toward life. Dr. Harrison had given her 90 days to show improvement. She was on day 12, and already her blood pressure had dropped 20 points. Not from medication or meditation apps for Christian women over 50, but from this simple practice of meeting God at 5 a.m. without agenda, without performance, just presence. The false victory felt real. She'd slept until 4:30 last night, woke without panic, made it to 5 a.m. with anticipation instead of dread. Even Sarah had noticed something different in their last phone call. "Mom, you sound ... lighter. Not happy exactly, but less frightened." Margaret wanted to tell her about soul flowing, about Ruth's revolutionary teaching, about finding purpose after 50 through surrender instead of striving. But Sarah wasn't ready. She was still in her forcing years, her grinding decade, her perform or perish season. The internal saboteur tried one last assault. "This is temporary. The anxiety will return. You'll follow David's path." Moment of peace, then sudden death. This soul flowing is just another coping mechanism that will fail when you need it most. But even that voice seemed weaker, less convincing, like it knew its time was ending. Margaret wrote in her journal, Day 12, "I'm not afraid of the voice anymore. It's just another 347 wake-up call, another invitation to go deeper." Psalm 46:10 isn't a command to be still, it's a promise that when we stop forcing stillness, we discover we're already held in the stillness of God. This is what David knew. This is soul flowing. She looked at the clock, 5:55 a.m., almost time to return to the regular world, to answer Sarah's texts, to pretend at church that her transformation was coming from conventional faith rather than 5 a.m. kitchen encounters with the God who preferred honest darkness to performed light. But something had permanently shifted. She was no longer grinding toward healing, forcing herself toward wholeness. She was flowing, and that flow was carrying her somewhere she couldn't have imagined, from the prison of her 347 terror. The 60-day medical marker was approaching, but Margaret wasn't counting anymore. When you're learning to flow with eternal rhythm, temporary deadlines lose their power. She closed David's Bible, but the verse remained, written now on her heart, in tears and truth. "Be still and know, not tomorrow, not when healed. Now, in the breaking, in the darkness, in the 5 a.m. surrender that was teaching her who God really is." Soul flowing, Margaret read aloud from her journal, dated 20 years ago. Her younger handwriting, naive and hopeful, "is when I stop swimming against God's current and let Him carry me where I'm meant to go." She'd written this after her mother's death, then forgotten it completely, buried it under decades of religious performance and spiritual productivity that looked successful but felt like drowning. Finding it now, referenced in David's journal with a note, "Em already knows but has forgotten." Help her remember when ready felt like discovering she'd had the treasure map all along but had been holding it upside down. The soul-flowing method wasn't new. It was ancient, personal, written in her own hand before life taught her to grip instead of flow. Ruth laughed when Margaret showed her the journal. Of course you already knew. Every woman knows before she's taught to forget. The church specializes in teaching Christian women over 50 to forget their knowing, to trade intuition for instruction, to exchange flow for force. But soul-flowing real. Soul-flowing is just remembering what your soul knew before religion complicated it. Ruth pulled out a worn notebook filled with names, dates, testimonies. Look, every woman I've taught soul-flowing to eventually finds evidence. She already knew it. Letter from college, poem from their 20s, prayer from before they learned the right way to pray. We're not learning something new, Margaret. We're unlearning what buried the truth. Sarah's call interrupted at 5:23 a.m., right on schedule. Mom, I've been researching this soul-flowing thing you keep mentioning. It sounds like New Age meditation dressed up in Christian language. This isn't biblical, it's dangerous. Margaret felt the old pattern rising. Defend, explain, apologize, abandon her truth for her daughter's comfort. But soul-flowing had taught her a different response. Sarah, I wrote about soul-flowing in 1984, before you were born, before I knew it had a name. It's not New Age, it's as old as Hannah's prayer, as Mary's surrender, as every woman who's ever stopped forcing and started flowing. I can't explain it in terms you'll accept, but I can tell you this: I slept 7 hours last night. First time since Dad died. The silence on the other end stretched long before Sarah spoke, her lawyer voice cracking. 7 hours. Mom, that's how. And there it was, the first crack in her daughter's armor, the beginning of curiosity overtaking criticism. I stopped fighting the 3:47 wake-up, Margaret said simply. Started meeting it as invitation instead of invasion. Started flowing with what is instead of forcing what should be. It's what Dad discovered before he died, not how to avoid death, but how to flow with life, even when life includes loss. This morning routine with God isn't about routine, it's about rhythm. Not our rhythm, but heaven's. Margaret hung up gently, knowing Sarah would call back, would resist more, would eventually surrender, like all daughters do when they see their mothers transformed rather than explained. She returned to her journal, to the page where her younger self had written prophetically, "Someday I'll teach this to other women who've forgotten how to flow." At 57, someday had arrived. The soul-flowing method was beginning to take shape, not as technique, but as remembering, not as practice, but as return. She wrote in the margin of today's entry, "The method is no method. The practice is presence. The technique is trust. Flow like water, not like machinery." This is what finding purpose after 50 means, not discovering something new but uncovering what was always there, waiting beneath the performance, patient in the darkness, flowing like an underground river toward the sea of God's presence. 7 days of 5 a.m. meetings, and Margaret finally understood what David meant by the space between breaths where God lives. It happened at 5:43 a.m., unexpected and undeniable, a single breath that carried no anxiety, no grief, no forcing, just pure being. For exactly 4 seconds, Margaret existed without story, without loss, without the grinding effort of staying alive. She was simply breath breathing itself, presence being present, soul flowing without Margaret getting in the way. It lasted only a moment, but that moment changed everything. Like seeing color after years of gray, like hearing music after decades of noise. This was what Ruth called the first kiss of freedom, when you realize peace isn't something you achieve but something you allow. Sarah's secret tumbled out in a text at 5:45 a.m., as if she'd been waiting for her mother to find that moment of calm before confessing. "Mom, I've been waking at 3:47 too. Since Dad died, thought it was just stress from the case I'm working, but it's every night, same time. I'm scared I'm having a breakdown." Margaret stared at the message, understanding flooding through her like warm oil. The 3:47 wake-up wasn't just hers, was generational, inherited, a family rhythm calling them to something deeper than sleep. David had known. His journal mentioned the Robertson women's midnight calling, and will need this when her time comes. Sarah's time had come, but she was fighting it with sleeping pills and therapy. forcing her way toward normal instead of flowing toward truth. "Come home," Margaret typed, surprising herself with the authority in her words. "Not for a visit, for soul-flowing training. 5 days. Bring nothing but openness." Sarah's response was predictable. "I can't just leave work. I have responsibilities." This is exactly the kind of impulsive behavior that worries me about you. But Margaret had learned something in 7 days of 5 a.m. encounters. When God calls, responsibility looks different. She typed back, "Your body is waking you at 3:47 for a reason. You can spend the next 90 days in therapy trying to stop it, or 5 days with me learning to flow with it." Dad left instructions. "You're ready whether you know it or not." The internal saboteur tried to undermine this newfound authority. "You barely understand soul flowing yourself. What makes you think you can teach Sarah? You'll damage her career, her stability, her faith." But the voice had lost its venom, become more like a worried aunt than a destroying angel. Margaret actually felt compassion for it, this voice that had kept her safe through performing rightness, that had protected her from the vulnerability of being real. "Thank you for trying to protect me," she said aloud to the empty kitchen. "But I don't need protection anymore. I need transformation, and so does Sarah." Ruth arrived unannounced at 6 a.m., something she'd never done before. "Felt the shift," she said simply, helping herself to coffee. "That breath of commit ripples out, calls others ready to flow. Sarah's coming, isn't she?" Margaret nodded, wondering how Ruth knew things, wondering if soul flowing gave you prophetic sight or if it just made you pay attention to what was always there. "Good," Ruth continued. 3 generations of Robertson women about to learn what the men discovered first. David, his father, probably his grandfather, they all had the 347 calling. But it's the women's turn now. The world needs maternal wisdom that flows, not forces. Sarah's resistance is about to become her greatest teacher. Ruth left as suddenly as she'd come, but her words remained, maternal wisdom that flows. Margaret looked at her reflection in the kitchen window, still 57, still widowed, but somehow becoming the matriarch of a wisdom she was only beginning to understand. At 3:47 a.m. on day 41, the terror came back with vengeance, like it had been gathering strength for this assault. Margaret woke gasping, sheets soaked, heart hammering the old familiar rhythm of panic. But this time was different, worse. The chest pain felt real, radiating down both arms, jaw clenching. Textbook heart attack symptoms that even soul flowing couldn't explain away. The internal saboteur roared back to life. This is it. David's genetic legacy. All that 5 a.m. flowing was just postponing the inevitable. You're dying, just like him. And your spiritual experiment can't save you. Margaret reached for her phone to call 911, then stopped. If she was dying, did she want her last minutes to be in an ambulance, or in the kitchen where she'd been learning to live? She chose the kitchen, stumbling downstairs at 4:15, each step a negotiation with her body that felt like betrayal. But when she reached David's chair, something shifted. Not the pain that remained, sharp and insistent, but her relationship to it. "Okay," she said aloud to the pain, to God, to whatever was happening. "If this is death, I choose to flow with it. If it's not, I still choose to flow." She didn't take her pulse, didn't check her blood pressure, didn't even take an aspirin. She just sat, opened David's Bible to wherever it fell, and waited. The page was Isaiah 43:2. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." David had written in the margin, "The waters don't stop being deep. You just stop drowning." Sarah arrived at 4:47, using her key, finding her mother sitting calmly, despite obvious distress. "Mom, we need to get you to the hospital. You're having a heart attack." But Margaret held up her hand, and something in her authority stopped Sarah cold. "No, honey, I'm having a teaching. Sit down. This is part of soul flowing, meeting the terror without fleeing, flowing with fear instead of forcing courage. If I die in the next 13 minutes before 5 a.m., I die flowing. If I live, we both learn something about biblical rest for women that no sermon ever taught." Sarah sat paralyzed by her mother's strange peace in the face of what looked like cardiac crisis. At exactly 5 a.m., the pain vanished. Not gradually, not with explanation, just gone like it had never been. Margaret took her first full breath in an hour, and Sarah gasped as if she'd been holding hers too. What just happened? Sarah whispered, her rational lawyer mind struggling with the irrational evidence. Margaret smiled, remembering Ruth's words about spiritual tests. Night terrors don't stop coming just because you learn soul flowing. They come back to see if you'll abandon the flow for the force, if you'll choose medical over mystical, if you'll trust pills over presence. I'm not saying don't seek medical help, I'm saying learn the difference between body breaking and soul teaching. Sarah's resistance crumbled completely. Mom, I need this. Whatever this is, I need it. I can't keep living in terror of becoming you while secretly already being you. Teach me soul flowing, but first we're going to the doctor to make sure you're okay. Margaret agreed, knowing the tests would show nothing, knowing Dr. Harrison would credit the soul flowing practices with her improved numbers, knowing Sarah needed medical confirmation before she could accept mystical transformation. They drove to the ER together, Sarah's hand holding her mother's. Role reversal complete. The EKG was normal. Blood work perfect. All indicators showing a healthy 57-year-old woman who'd just survived something medicine couldn't measure. Panic attack, the doctor concluded, but Margaret and Sarah knew better. It was a soul-flowing test, and Margaret had passed by, choosing to flow even with death at the door. The kitchen transformed at 5 a.m. on day 45. Not metaphorically, but actually walls seemed to breathe with light that had no source. Air thick with presence that made Margaret's skin tingle with recognition. This was what David had tried to describe in his final journal entry. The veil doesn't lift, it dissolves. The kitchen becomes the throne room. Soul flowing isn't technique, it's transportation. Margaret sat in wonder as her ordinary space became sanctuary. Every surface sacred, every shadow singing. She wasn't having a vision or breakdown. She was seeing what was always there, hidden under the mundane, waiting for eyes adjusted to 5 a.m. light to perceive. This was the breakthrough Ruth had promised, not feeling better, but seeing better, seeing that the holy had been hiding in her house all along. Jennifer's message appeared on the Christian Women Over 50 forum at exactly the same moment. Is anyone else experiencing their house becoming a temple at 5 a.m.? Like God moved in and redecorated with invisible glory. Margaret laughed, realizing the synchronicity wasn't coincidence, but soul-flowing mature women around the world waking to the same revelation at the same moment. She typed back, yes, day 45 of soul flowing. Kitchen is now holy ground. Can't explain it. Don't need to. Within minutes, 17 women responded with similar experiences, bathroom mirrors becoming portals, bedroom corners becoming prayer chambers, ordinary spaces transformed by extraordinary presence. They were all learning that finding purpose after 50 meant finding the sacred in the supposedly mundane. David's presence felt different this morning. Not the ghostly memory that haunted her nights, but something more substantial. Like he was just in the next room, separated by something thinner than walls. Margaret spoke to him directly for the first time since the funeral. You knew, didn't you? This is what you were trying to tell me that last morning. Soul flowing isn't about going somewhere sacred. It's about recognizing where we are is already sacred. She felt rather than heard his response, a warmth that wrapped around her like his arms used to. A confirmation that death was just another room in God's house, and soul flowing taught you how to feel the connecting doors. Sarah walked in at 5:30, stopping abruptly at the kitchen threshold. Mom, what the air is different. It's like ... thick. Alive. She'd been staying for a week, learning soul-flowing basics, but this was her first experience of breakthrough presence. Margaret watched her daughter's rationality crumble beautifully, replaced by the wonder of a child discovering the ocean. This is what Dad felt. Sarah whispered, tears streaming. This is why he got up at 5 a.m. Not for discipline, but for this. Margaret nodded, remembering her own first breakthrough. The moment when spiritual productivity stopped being about producing and started being about perceiving. Ruth had warned that breakthroughs were beginnings, not endings. When your kitchen becomes cathedral, that's not graduation, that's kindergarten. Soul flowing goes deeper. Wait until you discover that you're not just in the presence, you are the presence, flowing through you to others. Margaret wrote in her journal, Day 45, Breakthrough. Not breaking through to something, but breaking through as something. I'm not the same person who collapsed on this floor. I'm becoming what David saw I could be, a woman who flows with divine rhythm, who finds God in kitchen light, who teaches others that 5 a.m. is when heaven visits earth, disguised as ordinary morning, waiting for extraordinary women to notice. She looked at Sarah, who was still standing in the doorway, afraid to enter or retreat. Come in, Margaret said with new authority. This is your inheritance, not money or property, but morning glory. 5 a.m. transformation, the soul-flowing legacy of the Robertson women. Martha was right. Mary was incomplete, Ruth declared at 5 a.m., her words shattering every women's Bible study Margaret had ever taught. Here's the scripture that proves both are needed for true spiritual productivity. She opened to Luke 10. But instead of the usual interpretation, Ruth pointed to what everyone missed. Martha welcomed Jesus into her house. Mary sat at Jesus' feet in Martha's house. Without Martha's work, Mary had no place to worship. Without Mary's worship, Martha's work had no point. Soul flowing isn't choosing one over the other. It's learning when to Martha and when to Mary, when to force and when to flow. The internal saboteur tried to protest with decades of teaching. This is heresy. Mary chose the better part. Jesus himself said so. But Margaret was learning to recognize when traditional interpretation had become limitation. She'd spent 57 years forcing herself to be Mary, when her nature was Martha. Then condemning herself for failing at contemplation. What if, she said slowly, testing the thought, Christian women over 50 have been set up to fail by being told to choose? What if finding purpose after 50 means embracing both, flowing when it's time to flow, forcing when force is needed, like a river that sometimes meanders and sometimes cascades? Ruth pulled out a diagram that looked like a river map. See, soul flowing has seasons. Sometimes you're in the rapids, that's forcing season, when action is required, when Martha energy builds the kingdom. Sometimes you're in the pools, that's flowing season, when Mary energy receives the kingdom. The problem is we've been taught that spiritual rest means always being in the pools, but rivers die without rapids. Your 3:47 wake-ups, those are rapids, forcing you awake because something needs to be built. Your 5 a.m. peace, that's the pool where you rest in what you've built. Sarah, who'd been quietly journaling, suddenly spoke. This changes everything about overcoming burnout Christian style. We don't overcome it, we flow with it. Burnout happens when we're forcing in flowing season or flowing in forcing season. Mom, your collapse wasn't because you were doing too much. It was because you were forcing yourself to flow when grief demanded you force your way through. Dad's death required Martha energy, practical, forceful, getting things done. But you tried to marry your way through it. All peaceful acceptance and contemplative surrender. Margaret stared at her daughter, who'd just diagnosed 2 years of suffering, in 2 sentences. The journal entry that morning became Margaret's Manifesto 2.0. Soul flowing isn't passive. It's the most active surrender possible, actively discerning when to push and when to yield, when to build and when to behold. I've been trying to force peace, which is like trying to force water uphill. But I've also been trying to flow through things that require force, like grief and change, and finding purpose after 50. The river metaphor is perfect. Water flows around rocks, it can't move, but it also carves canyons when flowing isn't enough. Today I learned that biblical rest includes holy forcing, that Mary needs Martha's house, that Martha needs Mary's presence, and that soul-flowing women embody both. This is the heresy that will heal us, admitting that sometimes God wants us to force our way to freedom, then flow in the freedom we've forced open. The brain scans were Ruth's idea, her son being a neuroscientist who studied meditation's effects on aging minds. Let's see what soul flowing actually does to your gray matter, Ruth had said, arranging for Margaret and Sarah to participate in his research on spiritual practices and neuroplasticity. Now, staring at the images on Dr. Marcus's screen, Margaret understood why 3:47 a.m. happened. Why menopause and faith intersected in the darkness. Why Christian women over 50 were particularly susceptible to night terrors. See this? Dr. Marcus pointed to a glowing area. Your amygdala fear center is hyperactive at 3:47 a.m. due to cortisol spikes common in postmenopausal women. But look what happens after consistent 5 a.m. practice. He showed a second scan. The fear center had calmed, but more remarkably, new neural pathways had formed, connecting regions that rarely communicated. This is extraordinary, Dr. Marcus continued, his scientific detachment cracking with excitement. 8 weeks of what you call soul flowing has created neural pathways typically seen in advanced meditators with decades of practice. But there's something else, something I've never seen before. He pulled up another image. This region here, it's associated with temporal perception, how we experience time. In your scans, Margaret, it's completely reorganized. You're literally experiencing time differently than you were 2 months ago. Your brain has rewired itself to flow with what we might call eternal rhythm rather than chronological time. This might explain why practitioners report feeling like 5 a.m. exists outside normal time. Sarah's scan showed similar changes beginning. You can see the neural rewiring starting in Sarah's brain after just 1 week. The 3:47 wake up appears to be a biological invitation. The brain attempting to reorganize itself but meeting resistance from conditioned patterns. When you stop resisting and start what you call flowing, the rewiring accelerates. It's as if the brain has been trying to evolve, and soul flowing is the software update it's been waiting for. Margaret thought of David's journal entry. We're not broken, we're updating. 3:47 is the download time. 5 a.m. is the installation. The implications for mental health in aging women are staggering. Dr. Marcus said, already planning follow-up studies. If we can teach women to work with their 3:47 biology instead of against it, we could revolutionize treatment for anxiety, depression, and insomnia in the demographic most affected. This soul flowing isn't just spiritual practice, it's biological optimization disguised as religious experience. Sarah laughed. So God is using neuroscience to wake us up. Dr. Marcus smiled. Or neuroscience is discovering what mystics always knew, that spiritual practices create biological changes. Your mother's brain at 57 is more plastic, more adaptive than most 30-year-olds' eye scan. Margaret wrote in her journal that night, day 52. Science confirms what soul knew, we're being rewired for something beyond survival. The 3:47 wake-up is evolutionary, not pathological. Our brains are trying to upgrade, to flow with frequencies we couldn't perceive before. Finding purpose after 50 isn't metaphorical, it's measurable, visible in neural pathways, lighting up like constellation maps. David was right. We're not having breakdowns, we're having breakthroughs. Every Christian woman over 50, waking at 3:47, is being invited to evolve, to rewire, to become something that couldn't exist in younger neural patterns. This isn't spiritual rest, it's spiritual revolution, one synapse at a time. Tomorrow, Ruth teaches us about the birth of the 5 a.m. sisters. But tonight, I understand. We're not just changing ourselves, we're changing what it means to age, to wake, to flow with the rhythm of heaven that's been trying to rewire us all along. They came without invitation, drawn by something stronger than curiosity, desperation, mixed with hope, the cocktail that creates community. First was Jennifer from the online forum, driving 6 hours to sit in Margaret's kitchen at 5 a.m. Then Patricia from church, who'd been hiding her own 3:47 wake-ups for 3 years. By day 60, 7 women gathered each morning, their shadows stretching long in the sunrise, looking like ancient priestesses rather than exhausted midlife women. Ruth named them the 5 a.m. Sisters, and the name stuck, spreading through whispered conversations and private messages to Christian women over 50 who thought they were alone in their darkness. They didn't advertise, didn't evangelize, didn't need to. Soul flowing called its own. We're not a support group, Ruth clarified at their first official gathering, her living room cramped with 12 women clutching coffee and journals. Support groups help you cope with what is. We're a transformation circle, we help each other flow into what's becoming. The difference between forcing and flowing isn't just personal, it's communal. When one woman learns to flow, it creates a current that pulls others along. She pulled out a map, marked with red dots. These are confirmed 5 a.m. sisters across the country. 63 women who've transformed their 347 terror into 5 a.m. power. Each one is teaching others, not through programs but through presence. This is how revival really happens, not from platforms but from kitchens. Margaret watched Sarah leading a smaller circle of younger women, teaching them prevention rather than intervention. Don't wait until menopause and faith collide in crisis, Sarah was saying. Her lawyer precision applied to spiritual instruction. Start soul flowing now, in your 30s and 40s, so when the 347 calling comes and it will come you're ready to flow, instead of fight. The younger women took notes like their lives depended on it, perhaps sensing that their mothers' and grandmothers' struggles didn't have to be their destiny. Sarah had become what Margaret had hoped, not just healed but healing, not just flowing but creating currents for others. The internal saboteur made one last stand. This is getting out of hand. You're creating a cult, leading women away from traditional faith into dangerous territory. But its voice was so weak now that Margaret almost felt sorry for it. No, she said aloud, causing others to look up. We're leading women back to themselves, back to the knowing they had before religion taught them to forget. Cults control, we're liberating. Cults isolate, we're connecting. Cults demand uniformity, we're celebrating the unique way each woman flows. The others nodded, some speaking their own rebuttals to their inner critics. The room filling with the sound of women claiming their authority. Jennifer suggested they write a manifesto, something to explain soul flowing to the growing number of inquiries. But Ruth shook her head. The moment we codify it, we kill it. Soul flowing can't be captured in doctrine, it has to be experienced at 5 a.m. Discovered in your own kitchen, found in your own 347 darkness. We're not creating a movement, we're acknowledging one that's already moving. The 5 a.m. Sisters aren't an organization but an organism, growing naturally from the soil of women's suffering and flowering into something nobody could have planned. Margaret thought of David's final journal entry. When the women understand soul flowing, everything changes, not just for them but for everyone they touch. The world needs mothers who've been through the fire and learned to flow like water. M will be one of the first, but not the last. The 5 a.m. Sisters are coming. He'd known, somehow, that his death would birth something his life couldn't have created, a sisterhood of the sacred hour. Women who'd learned that finding purpose after 50 meant finding each other, at 5 a.m. The miracle happened on night 77. Margaret slept through 3:47 a.m. Not from exhaustion or medication, but from a peace so complete that her body forgot to panic. She woke naturally at 4:58, 2 minutes before her alarm, feeling something she hadn't experienced since before David's death. Rested, deeply, completely, cellularly rested. Her first thought wasn't gratitude, but curiosity. Why now? What had shifted? Then she saw it, placed on David's pillow, that she'd finally stopped treating like a shrine. His final journal, the one she'd been afraid to read, the one marked for M, when she's learned to flow. Sarah must have found it, known it was time, placed it where Margaret would find it when she was ready. David's final entry was dated 5 a.m., 3 hours before his death. My love, if you're reading this, you've discovered what I spent 3 years learning. Soul flowing isn't about avoiding death, but about living fully until it comes. I woke at 3:47 every night for 3 years before I understood it was preparation, not punishment. God was teaching me to flow so I could face my ending without forcing my way through fear. I'm not afraid this morning, even though I feel the stirring that says today is the day. I'm flowing toward whatever comes, and I need you to know it's not tragic. It's the ultimate soul flow, from temporal to eternal, from forcing breath to flowing into the breath of God. Margaret read through tears that weren't sad but sacred. I see you. 3 years from now, learning what I learned, teaching what I couldn't teach, becoming what I always knew you were. Woman who transforms darkness into light, not by forcing but by flowing. The 3:47 wake up I know you're experiencing isn't your body breaking down but breaking open. The 5 a.m. meetings aren't discipline but devotion. And when you finally sleep through 347, like I pray you did last night, it's not because you're healed, but because you're whole. The fear has no more to teach you. You've graduated from the School of Night Terror into the University of Soul Flowing. The journal contained more detailed notes about soul flowing practices, observations about the connection between grief and growth, prophecies about the 5 a.m. sisters that were startlingly accurate. But it was his final paragraph that undid her completely. Margaret, my soul's companion, you're going to think I left you, but I didn't. I just float ahead to prepare the way. Every 5 a.m. when you sit in the kitchen, I'm there. Not as ghost, but as graduate, cheering you on from the other side of the veil that soul flowing makes thin. When you teach other women what you've learned, you're teaching them what we learned together, that love doesn't die, it just learns to flow in new forms. Your 347 darkness has been our 5 a.m. reunion. And now that you know how to flow, we're never really apart. Sarah found her an hour later, still holding the journal, face radiant with something beyond grief or joy. He knew everything. Margaret whispered every step of this journey, every terror, every breakthrough. He went first to show it was safe to flow all the way home. Sarah held her mother, both of them crying the kind of tears that heal rather than hurt. Mom, Sarah said finally, you slept through 347. Does that mean soul flowing is complete? Margaret smiled, remembering Ruth's words about beginnings disguised as endings. No, honey, it means I'm ready for the advanced course teaching others that death is just another doorway. That 347 darkness leads to 5 a.m. light. That finding purpose after 50 sometimes means losing everything before you find out you've lost nothing at all. Standing in her bedroom at 3:47 a.m. on day 90, the medical deadline, the moment of truth, Margaret felt the familiar stirring but not the terror. Her arms were open, not in surrender but in welcome, greeting the darkness like an old friend who'd taught her hard but necessary lessons. I'm not afraid of the night anymore, she said aloud, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd wrestled angels and learned they were on her side all along. The internal saboteur was silent, not dead but transformed. No longer the voice of wasted years, but the voice of wisdom, reminding her of dangers while trusting her to navigate them. Even the chest tightness felt different, not like dying but like expanding, making room for more life than her old self could have contained. Sarah stood in the doorway, having felt the shift from her room. Soul flowing had made them synchronous, aware of each other's spiritual weather. Mom, you're glowing. Like, actually glowing, and she was. Not with visible light, but with something more substantial, the radiance of someone who'd been through the refiner's fire and emerged as gold. Your father saw this, Margaret said, pulling Sarah into the room where so many nights of terror had played out. In his journal, he wrote that I'd become luminous with truth by day 90. I thought it was metaphor, but soul flowing has taught me that metaphor and reality dance together at 5 a.m. Dr. Harrison's appointment was at 9 a.m., but Margaret already knew what he'd find: blood pressure normal, heart rhythm steady, all markers of health rather than crisis. The real test wasn't medical but spiritual, and she'd passed by learning to flow with what is rather than forcing what should be. 3 months ago, I was dying, she told Sarah, as they prepared to leave. Not physically though, it felt physical but spiritually. I was trying to force my way back to who I was before Dad died, grinding against reality like sandpaper against stone. Soul flowing taught me to become water instead, soft enough to yield, strong enough to carve canyons, fluid enough to take any shape while remaining essentially myself. The 5 a.m. sisters had gathered to pray. 20 women now, with groups forming in 7 states. Jennifer had started a private online community, not to promote soul flowing, but to support those already called to it. We don't recruit, she'd said. The 347 Wake Up does that for us. We just provide community for those who've answered the call. Patricia was writing a book, not a how-to, but a what-is, describing the phenomenon without prescribing the solution. Ruth was training facilitators, women who'd graduated from their own night terrors into morning glory. The movement David had foreseen was happening, but not as movement as awakening, one woman at a time. 347 terror transformed into 5 a.m. triumph. I need to tell you something, Sarah said as they parked at the medical center. I'm pregnant. Found out this morning at 5 a.m. The test was positive. And Mom, I'm not afraid. Not of labor, not of motherhood, not of the 3:47 wake-ups that will come with a newborn. Because now I know those wake-ups aren't interruption, but invitation. I'll teach her soul flowing from the beginning, so she never has to forget and remember like we did. Margaret pulled her daughter close, understanding that the legacy was already passing forward, that David's grandchild would grow up knowing that darkness was just light, waiting to be recognized. That forcing was sometimes necessary, but flowing was always possible. That 5 a.m. was when heaven touched earth and invited anyone brave enough to meet it there. The circle of women at sunrise looked like something ancient and eternal. 23 souls who'd graduated from the University of Night Terror, standing in Margaret's backyard as the first light painted the sky purple gold. They weren't holding hands but flowing together, each maintaining her own rhythm while contributing to the collective current. Ruth stood in the center, no longer the church janitor, but the recognized elder of the 5 a.m. sisters, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been flowing for 30 years. This is your commission, not to convince anyone of anything, but to be so radiantly transformed that others ask what happened. When they do, you tell them, I learned to stop grinding and start flowing. Meet me at 5 a.m. if you want to know more. Margaret looked around the circle. Jennifer, who'd driven 6 hours that first time and never really left. Patricia, whose book would soon tell the world what they'd discovered. Sarah, one hand on her still flat belly, already teaching the next generation. And others whose names would never be famous, but whose transformation would ripple through families, churches, communities. These weren't just Christian women over 50 who'd overcome anxiety. They were pioneers of a new kind of spiritual productivity. Not producing more, but perceiving more. Not achieving peace, but acknowledging the peace that was always there, hidden under the grinding. Every woman watching this, Margaret said, knowing somehow that their story would be shared. Who wakes at 3:47 with racing heart and racing mind? Who feels like she's dying when she's actually being born? Who thinks finding purpose after 50 is about doing more when it's really about forcing less? You're not broken. You're not failing. You're being invited to soul flowing, to the rhythm David discovered and died flowing with, that Ruth has been teaching for 3 decades, that your body already knows, but your mind has forgotten. This isn't about joining our group or following our method. It's about meeting God in your own kitchen at 5 a.m. and discovering what's been waiting there all along. The sun broke fully over the horizon, and the women began to disperse. Not with the exhaustion of another sleepless night, but with the energy of those who'd learned to flow with, rather than against life's rhythm. Sarah pulled Margaret aside. Mom, what do we tell them, the ones who want a program, a book, a clear path to follow? Margaret smiled, remembering her own desperate need for instructions, for someone to tell her exactly how to stop the 3:47 terror. We tell them what Ruth told me. Meet God at 5 a.m. for 30 days. Don't bring an agenda. Just bring yourself. Let soul flowing teach you what no human can, how to transform forcing into flowing, grinding into grace, terror into triumph. As the last sister left, Margaret stood alone in her backyard, but not lonely, never lonely anymore. The presence that had terrified her at 3:47 now surrounded her like liquid light, flowing through her to others who were just beginning to wake up, literally and figuratively. She thought of David, flowing somewhere beyond, but not far, probably laughing at how long it took her to understand what he'd tried to tell her that last morning. The voice no longer saboteur, but sage whispered one last truth. This isn't ending, but beginning. Every woman who reads this, who recognizes herself in your story, who admits she's been grinding when she could be flowing, she's the next chapter. Soul flowing isn't yours or David's or Ruth's. It belongs to every woman brave enough to meet her terror at 3:47 and transform it into triumph by 5 a.m. The invitation is extended. The kitchen is waiting. The flow is beginning. The journey from 3:47 darkness to 5 a.m. light plays like a movie in reverse. Margaret on the kitchen floor, coffee spreading like blood, transformed into Margaret standing in sunrise, arms open, unafraid. David's empty pillow becoming his journal of secrets. The bathroom mirror that showed a dying woman now reflecting someone luminous with life. Each 3:47 wake-up that felt like death becoming a doorway to something more alive than sleep ever offered. 90 days compressed into moments the collapse. The surrender, Ruth's first teaching, Sarah's resistance, then acceptance. The 5 a.m. sisters gathering, and finally, gloriously, sleeping through 3:47 because the lesson was complete. The flowing had begun, the terror had become teacher. Across the country, women set their alarms for 4:55 a.m., not to force themselves awake, but to accept the invitation their bodies had been extending through 3:47 terror. In Seattle, a corporate executive discovers her panic attacks are labor pains for a new kind of leadership. In Miami, a grandmother stops taking sleeping pills and starts taking notes on the wisdom that comes in darkness. In small towns and big cities, Christian women over 50 stop hiding their night struggles and start honoring them as holy. The online forum grows from dozens to hundreds to thousands, not recruited but recognized. Each woman finding her way to soul flowing because her body wouldn't let her sleep through the invitation anymore. My mother went from calling 911 at 3:47 a.m. to teaching others at 5 a.m. But this isn't a success story about overcoming anxiety. It's about understanding that anxiety was never the enemy. It was the alarm clock for a spiritual awakening that medicine couldn't provide and religion couldn't explain. Watching her transform taught me that finding purpose after 50 or any age isn't about forcing your way to peace but flowing with the chaos until it reveals its pattern. I'm 32, pregnant, and when my daughter wakes me at 3:47 a.m., I'll know exactly what to do, not because I learned it in a book, but because I watched my mother die to who she was and be born into who she was meant to be. That's soul-flowing, dying and being born simultaneously, every morning at 5 a.m. Here's your prescription, not from a doctor, but from women who've walked through the valley of the shadow of 3:47 and emerged at 5 a.m. Transformed, for 90 days, when you wake at 3:47, and you will. Once you acknowledge the invitation, don't fight it. Get up. Go to your kitchen or wherever feels sacred. Sit with whatever Bible or journal feels right. Don't force prayer or study or anything. Just be present to the presence that's been trying to get your attention through insomnia, anxiety, hot flashes, and heart palpitations. Give it 90 days of showing up at 5 a.m. Not perfectly, not religiously, but honestly. Let soul flowing teach you the difference between grinding and gliding, between forcing and flowing. Document what happens. Share it with one other woman who wakes at 3:47. Watch the ripple become a wave. When you answer the 3:47 call with 5 a.m. presence, everything changes, not immediately, not obviously, but irrevocably. Your anxiety doesn't disappear. It transforms into awareness. Your grief doesn't heal. It becomes a gateway. Your exhaustion doesn't lift. It teaches you when to rest and when to rise. You don't become a different person. You become who you always were beneath the performing, forcing, grinding. Soul flowing doesn't promise easy, it promises real. And for Christian women over 50, who've been accepting substitutes for too long, real is the revolution that changes everything. 1 year later, Margaret's kitchen, 5 a.m., but she's not alone. The room is full: Sarah, nursing her baby, Ruth making coffee, Jennifer writing, Patricia editing, and 7 new faces. Women who woke at 3:47 this morning for the first time, terrified, certain they were dying, found Margaret's story online, and drove through the night to be here. Welcome to your first 5 a.m., Margaret says, her voice carrying the authority of someone who's been to hell and back and discovered it was just heaven in disguise. You're not broken. You're breaking open. You're not dying. You're being born. The soul flowing you're about to discover isn't mine or yours. It's the rhythm that's been trying to wake us up all along. God's been waiting in your kitchen since before you were born, and now, finally, you're ready to meet him there. The camera pulls back through the window as the sun rises, showing the house from outside, ordinary suburban home lit from within by something more than electricity. The last sound is a whisper, maybe wind, maybe voice, maybe God. Soul flowing, available every morning at 5 a.m. for those brave enough to stop forcing and start flowing. The clock in the corner reads 3:47 a.m. because someone, somewhere, is just beginning to wake up. What's your soul-flowing commitment today? Write it below in the comments. If you're ready to transform your 3:47 a.m. wake-ups into 5 a.m. power, type "I'm ready to flow" and share this with every Christian woman over 50 who needs to know she's not alone. She's not broken, and her best years aren't behind her, they're beginning right now, in the darkness before dawn, where soul flowing teaches us who we really are.